The cold iron gates of the Villa de las Sombras didn't just close behind me. They felt like a guillotine severing my past from my future. I stood there, clutching a single leather satchel and the keys to a rusted sedan, while the humid air of Valencia pressed against my lungs like a physical weight. My father, Ricardo, a man whose pride was as vast as the vineyards he managed, hadn't even looked me in the eye when he told me to vanish. My mother, Sophia, stood behind him, her face a mask of practiced indifference, her fingers nervously twisting a gold crucifix that she clearly didn't believe in. The excuse was simple, almost elegant in its cruelty. My sister, Elena, was returning home, glowing with the news of a pregnancy that had seemingly washed away every sin she'd ever committed. I was 20 years old, drowning in the final weeks of my architecture degree. And suddenly, my bedroom was no longer mine. It was to be a nursery for a child fathered by a man I had never met. Ricardo's voice had been a low growl, telling me that I was a man now and that a man figures out his own path. Sophia had added the final twist of the blade, whispering that they had given enough and that it was now Elena's turn to be the sun around which the family orbited. But as I walked toward my car, I saw something they hadn't intended for me to see. A sleek, black luxury SUV was parked in the shadows of the olive grove, and a man I didn't recognize, a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and a gaze like a predator, was watching the house from behind tinted glass. I didn't know then that this man, Don Diego, was the architect of my family's impending ruin. All I knew was that I was being discarded. I spent the first night parked on the cliffs overlooking the Balearic Sea, the interior of my car, freezing as the Mediterranean. Wind howled through the gaps in the door frames. I stared at the digital clock on my dashboard, the red numbers mocking my exhaustion. In 1 week, I had 3 final exams that would determine the rest of my life. My parents knew this. They simply didn't care. They had chosen the daughter who brought them a legacy over the son who brought them only bills. The weeks that followed were a blurred montage of hunger and desperation. I moved between library carols and the back seat of my car, showering in the university gym and eating cold canned beans. My grades suffered, the brilliant architectural visions I once had replaced by the monotonous calculation of how much fuel I had left. I watched my family's life through the distorted lens of social media. Sophia posted photos of the grand nursery, painted in hues of soft gold and cream. There were pictures of Elena, laughing as she held a pair of tiny knitted booties, and Ricardo, looking more robust than ever, clinking glasses of sherry with that same silver-haired man, Don Diego. Something felt wrong. My parents were middle-class managers, yet the lifestyle they were suddenly flaunting, the vintage wines, the designer maternity clothes for Elena, didn't match their income. One evening, while I was huddled over my laptop in a dimly lit corner of a tapas bar using their free Wi-Fi, a woman approached me. It was Tia Isabella, my father's estranged sister, a woman who had been banished from the family circle years ago for asking too many questions. She didn't offer a hug. She offered a thick manila envelope. Without a word, she sat down and gestured for me to open it. Inside were copies of land deeds and bank statements. My name was at the bottom of several documents, forged signatures transferring my late grandmother's inheritance, a coastal plot of land I was supposed to receive at 21, to a holding company owned by Don Diego. The realization hit me harder than the expulsion. My parents hadn't kicked me out just to give Elena a room. They had kicked me out to ensure I wouldn't receive the legal notifications arriving at the house. They were selling my future to pay off a debt they owed to a man who looked like a saint but moved like a devil. Isabella told me that Elena was being kept in a gilded cage, fed lies that I had stolen money from the family and fled to Madrid to live a life of debauchery. My own sister, the woman who used to protect me from Ricardo's temper, believed I was a thief. The betrayal was a bitter poison, but the fire Isabella lit in my soul was stronger. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to wait for the right moment to reclaim what was stolen. 2 years passed in a cold, calculating silence. I had finished my degree against all odds, working 3 jobs to pay for a tiny studio in the outskirts of Seville. I had become a ghost to them until the invitation arrived. It wasn't a card. It was a summons to a grand estate in Alicante. Elena was marrying Alejandro, the baby daddy. who had finally been deemed worthy of the family name. The letter from my mother was dripping with false sentiment, claiming they missed me and that the misunderstandings of the past should be buried for the sake of the family's honor. But I knew the truth. Don Diego's name was listed as the guest of honor and patron on the wedding program Isabella had intercepted. The wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a closing ceremony for a business deal. When I arrived at the estate, the scent of orange blossoms was suffocating. I didn't go to the ceremony. I waited for the reception, standing in the shadows of the marble pillars like a specter from a forgotten tragedy. My parents looked radiant, their faces tight with the expensive Botox that my stolen inheritance had likely funded. Elena looked beautiful but brittle, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit. When she finally saw me, the glass of champagne in her hand trembled. She approached me, not with an apology, but with a desperate whisper, begging to know why I had abandoned her when she was sick and alone. It was then that I realized the depth of the manipulation. My parents had intercepted every letter I sent, blocked every call, and painted me as a monster to the only person who had ever loved me. The plot twist came during the toasts. Ricardo stood up, glowing with pride, and announced a vow renewal for himself and Sophia to take place immediately after the cake cutting. He called it a celebration of enduring loyalty. But as he spoke, I saw Don Diego signal to two men in suits at the back of the room. This wasn't a vow renewal. It was a public signing of the final transfer of the estate, a spectacle designed to hide a crime in plain sight. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I waited for Elena to take the microphone for her speech. She looked at our parents, then at me, then at the man she was marrying. I had slipped a single piece of paper, the forged deed, into her bouquet earlier that evening. The aftermath of the wedding was not a scene of celebration, but a battlefield of silence. As the Guardia Civil led Ricardo and Sofia away for questioning, the grand estate of Alicante felt like a hollow shell of gold and lies. I stood on the terrace, watching the red and blue lights flicker against the Mediterranean pines. Alejandro, the man I had dismissed as a mere pawn in my parents' game, approached me. He didn't speak. He simply handed me a flask of brandy and a small, encrypted USB drive. It was then I realized that Alejandro wasn't the simpleton my parents had portrayed. Throughout the last 2 years, he had been the one whispering in Tia Isabella's ear, the one who had quietly documented the illegal transfers while living under my parents' roof. He had played the role of the devoted, easily manipulated son-in-law to perfection, all while building a case that would eventually dismantle Don Diego's empire. He was the silent guardian Elena didn't even know she had, a man who had married into a den of vipers just to burn it down from the inside. But the web was deeper than I imagined. As I sat in a secluded motel room that night, scrolling through the files on the drive, a new name appeared repeatedly: Lucia. She was Sophia's younger sister, the forgotten aunt who had moved to Argentina decades ago. The records showed that she hadn't stayed in South America. She was the one who had introduced Ricardo to Don Diego, acting as a middleman for a series of predatory loans that had spiraled out of control. Lucia wasn't just a relative. She was the shadow behind the predator, the side antagonist who had fueled Sophia's greed and Ricardo's vanity until they were willing to sell their own son. She had played on their insecurities, promising them a seat at the table of the Spanish elite if they only liquidated certain family assets, my assets. Every cold night I spent in that car, every meal I skipped, was a brick in the mansion she was helping them build on a foundation of theft. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing into my chest. My mother, the woman who used to sing me to sleep, had conspired with her sister to erase my future. The detective work Alejandro had done revealed that the debt my parents owed wasn't a business failure. It was a gambling habit fueled by Lucia's high-stakes underground clubs in Marbella. They hadn't just lost my inheritance. They had lost their souls to a sisterhood of greed. As I looked at the photos of the forged signatures, I saw that some of them weren't even Ricardo's handwriting. They were Sophia's. My mother hadn't just been a passive witness. She was the primary architect of the forgery. She had used her knowledge of my handwriting from years of helping with my schoolwork to craft the perfect lie. The realization was a cold blade to the heart, turning my grief into a focused, icy rage. With the evidence in hand, I didn't go to the police right away. I wanted to see the look in Lucia's eyes when she realized the discarded son held the keys to her prison cell. I tracked her to a private villa in Malaga, a place built with blood money and stolen dreams. When I arrived, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and expensive tobacco. She was sitting by the pool, looking every bit the aristocrat she had pretended to be. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she smiled, a slow, serpentine curve of the lips that made my skin crawl. She told me that I should thank her, that being kicked out had made me stronger, a true man of the world. She spoke about the family as if it were a business project that had simply reached its expiration date. But then, the final twist revealed itself. Lucia wasn't working for Don Diego. Don Diego was working for her. He was merely the face, the muscle used to intimidate and manipulate. Lucia had been the one orchestrating the downfall of several families in the region, using her sister and brother-in-law as the opening act. She admitted that she had intended for Elena's child to be raised as the heir to her own dark empire, a way to keep the bloodline pure but under her total control. My expulsion hadn't just been about money. It had been a test to see if I was weak enough to be ignored or strong enough to be recruited. I wasn't there to be recruited. I was there to be the witness to her downfall. As she reached for a hidden drawer in her table, Alejandro appeared from the shadows of the veranda. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by the very officers who had arrested my parents. Alejandro revealed his final card. He was a former financial crimes investigator, whose own father had been ruined by Lucia years ago. He had pursued this case for a decade, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The marriage to Elena had been a risk, a deep cover operation that had turned into something more real than he ever intended. He looked at me, a silent apology in his eyes for the pain I had endured, but also a grim satisfaction. Lucia's smile finally faded as the handcuffs clicked into place. The grand design was over. The trial in Valencia was a slow, agonizing dissection of a corpse that had been rotting for years. Sitting in that oak-paneled room, I watched Ricardo and Sofia. They didn't look like the pillars of the community they had pretended to be. They looked small, withered by the weight of their own choices. Even then, facing years of imprisonment for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, my mother's eyes didn't hold a flicker of apology. When the judge read the verdict, she simply looked at her manicured nails, as if the destruction of her son's life was merely a clerical error she could eventually fix. Ricardo was different. He broke, not from guilt, but from the realization that his name, the only thing he truly worshipped, was now synonymous with a cheap street hustle. They were sentenced to 12 years each, a lifetime for people who had already spent their best years chasing shadows. Don Diego, ever the survivor, had turned state's witness against Lucia, trading his freedom for the soul of the woman who had built him. The recovery of the estate was not the victory I had expected. The Villa de las Sombras was legally returned to me, but walking through those halls felt like trespassing in a graveyard of my own childhood. I stripped the fake gold leaf from the walls and tore down the heavy velvet curtains that had hidden so many secrets. Alejandro stayed by Elena's side, his mission of vengeance completed, but his love for her proving to be the only real thing in a world of illusions. He confessed to me that he had initially approached her as a target, a way to get to Lucia, but her innocence in the face of our parents' corruption had changed him. We spent the next year rebuilding, not just the walls, but the shattered remains of our sanity. When Elena's son was finally born, she didn't name him after our father or any of the noble ancestors Lucia had invented. She named him Mateo, after the brother she thought she had lost. I renamed the estate Villa de la Verdad, the House of Truth. It stands now as a beacon on the cliffs of the Mediterranean, a place where no one is ever discarded for the sake of a nursery or a debt. I used the remainder of my grandmother's inheritance to finish my degree and eventually designed a new wing for the villa, a sanctuary for students who find themselves without a home, a place I would have given anything for 10 years ago. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the evening, I look at the iron gates. They are no longer a guillotine. They are an invitation. The story that began with a cold expulsion in the middle of finals week ended with a realization that blood only makes you related, but loyalty and truth make you family. I am no longer the boy sleeping in a rusted sedan, shivering under the stars. I am the architect of a legacy that can never be sold or forged.